The phone buzzed relentlessly in my pocket, snapping me out of my thoughts. I wiped the sweat off my brow, glancing around the small office where I was working in New York. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was about to break. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, a constant reminder of how far I'd come from the quiet hills of Aspen. But despite the bright skyline and the noise of the city, a sinking feeling was growing in the pit of my stomach. I knew who was calling. Derek. My stepfather. I had learned long ago that calls from him were rarely good news, but I couldn't resist. With a sigh, I slid my finger across the screen and answered. Hello, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, as if the man on the other end didn't make my blood boil with just the sound of his voice. Jamie, Derek's voice came through, too cheerful, almost mocking. Got some news for you. I braced myself, the air in the room suddenly feeling colder. What is it? Well, you know that cabin of yours in Aspen? He asked, dragging out the words in that smug way he always did. Sold it. My heart stopped. The room seemed to close in around me as his words sank in. What? What do you mean, you sold it? Oh, come on, he chuckled. Don't act so surprised. I sold it. Needed the cash. Big debts, you know? Had to clear them somehow. I felt the floor shift beneath me as if I might crumble into nothing. The cabin, my cabin. The one my mother and I had built from the ground up, the place I went to escape, to heal. And now it was gone? Just like that? You can't be serious, I managed, trying to steady my voice, but failing miserably. You had no right. Relax, Jamie, Derek interrupted, a trace of amusement in his voice. I've been handling things while you're off doing whatever it is you do. What's the point of holding on to something you never use? I could feel the anger rising in my chest, hot and quick. My mind raced, recalling every moment I had spent in that cabin, every summer, every birthday, every moment of peace I'd had there. It was more than just a house, it was my refuge. And now, this man, this parasite who had wormed his way into our lives, had sold it without a second thought. For his own benefit. That cabin wasn't yours to sell, I snapped, my voice shaking now. I co-own it. You had no right to make that decision. Well, you know, he said with a dismissive laugh, it's all taken care of. It's done. The money's already in the bank. Trust me, you'll thank me for this. It's for the greater good. Mine, obviously. The nerve of him. The arrogance. The entitlement. You're not getting away with this, I said, barely able to contain my rage. I'll make sure of it. Before he could respond, I hung up, the weight of the phone in my hand somehow making it feel as if my entire world had shifted. I was shaking. A part of me wanted to scream, to throw something, to run to Aspen and confront him face to face. But I knew that wouldn't do any good. Derek was always 2 steps ahead, always manipulating, always finding a way to get what he wanted. But not this time. The cabin was my home, my memories, my safe haven. And I wasn't about to let him destroy that without a fight. I reached for my bag, the legal documents inside my desk drawer catching my eye. I had an agreement with Laura. The cabin wasn't just mine, it was ours. And Derek, as much as he thought he could control everything around him, didn't have the power to sell something that didn't belong to him. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a fight I wasn't going to lose. I stood up, my mind already running through what needed to be done. Derek had no idea what he had just unleashed. I stood frozen for a moment, the reality of what Derek had just done sinking in like a stone in my gut. My mind raced. I could still hear his voice, smug and casual, as though he'd just sold a used car. I had to do something. I couldn't let him think he could get away with this. I grabbed my coat and rushed out of the office, my heart pounding with each step. The city around me buzzed like normal, but I felt disconnected, like I was walking through a fog. Derek had crossed a line, and I knew that this time I wasn't going to let him win. I called Mary, my best friend, almost as soon as I stepped onto the street. Mary, it's Derek, I said, barely able to control the anger in my voice. He sold the cabin. He sold it. There was a beat of silence before her voice came through the phone, sharp with disbelief. What? He did what? Jamie, are you sure? I'm sure. He sold it. No warning, no asking, just, gone. I felt the tension in my chest tighten. He thinks it's done. He thinks he can just walk away with everything. But it's not his to sell. We both know that. Okay, calm down, Mary said, her voice steady despite the shock. We'll handle this. I'll be there soon. In the meantime, get all the documents, all of it. We need to make sure we have everything in order. I hung up, trying to steady my shaking hands. I had to focus. I had to think. The cabin wasn't just a building. It was everything. It held my memories, my mother's love, my childhood. I'd spent summers there, feeling at peace, away from the chaos of the world. And Eric? He had no right to take that from me. I wasn't some naive teenager anymore. I had resources, I had allies, and most importantly, I had the law on my side. I headed back to my apartment, the weight of what needed to be done settling heavily on my shoulders. As soon as I walked in, I went straight to the desk, pulling open the drawer where I kept the co-ownership agreement with Mary. We'd signed it years ago, knowing that one day, we might face something like this. Neither of us could sell the cabin without the other's consent. That was the key. I clutched the document, my fingers gripping the edges as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. Mary arrived an hour later, her face serious. What's the plan? She asked, her eyes scanning the room. I could see the fire in her. She wasn't the type to back down, not when it mattered. Not when it was something this important. We're going to stop this. I'm not going to let Derek get away with it. I've got everything we need. I've contacted a lawyer, and I'm going to find out exactly who bought the cabin and how Derek pulled this off, I said, my voice steady, though I could still feel the anger simmering beneath the surface. Mary nodded, her expression resolute. We'll make him pay for this, Jamie. You're right. He doesn't have the right to do this. Let's make sure he knows that. We spent the next several hours digging through paperwork, going through every email, every text, and every call that had passed between Derek and me over the years. We needed every shred of evidence we could find. The lawyer would need it all. We had to be prepared. Derek thought he had outsmarted me, but he didn't realize that I was done playing his games. The clock ticked on, the pressure mounting. I could feel the familiar dread of the past creeping up on me, reminding me of all the years I'd spent letting Derek push me around, manipulating me into doing what he wanted. But not anymore. Not this time. The next morning, I called the real estate agent listed in the county records. The moment I mentioned Derek's name, I could hear the hesitation on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, who? The agent asked, her voice unsure. I repeated the name. Derek? Oh, right. He came in, said he had all the necessary paperwork. But... She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. But there was something strange about it. The co-ownership didn't come up. If I'd known, I never would have gone through with it. I felt a surge of hope. There it was. A crack in Derek's plan. Can you send me all the documentation from that transaction? I asked, already jotting down her information. Of course. I'll email everything to you today. But you should know, the buyer still hasn't paid in full. Something about it raised a red flag. I thanked her, a plan already forming in my mind. This wasn't over. I wouldn't let it end like this. Derek thought he could just sell a piece of my soul for his gambling debts? Not a chance. With Mary by my side and the legal documents already in place, I knew what had to be done. We were going to take this to the authorities, and we were going to win. The buyer, unaware of the true ownership, would be easy to reach. And when Derek found out we were moving forward, he would finally realize that there was no way out. We would hold him accountable. We would make sure that he never underestimated me again. As I sat back in my chair, staring at the documents in front of me, a deep sense of determination washed over me. This was just the beginning. And Derek had no idea what was coming. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one passing in a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and legal jargon. But the anger that had first surged through me was now replaced with a cold, razor-sharp focus. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of property, I was fighting for something far more important. My peace of mind. My freedom. The right to live my life on my terms. Derek had taken so much from me over the years, but this? This was the final straw. I gathered the last of the evidence I needed, carefully organizing every document, every message, and every scrap of communication. Mary had been a rock through it all, helping me every step of the way. Together, we had assembled a case that was airtight. I had the law on my side, and now I was ready to confront Derek. I hadn't seen him in days, but I knew it was time. No more running. No more hiding. The morning of the confrontation arrived with a stillness in the air, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. I drove out to Aspen, my heart pounding as I neared the cabin. I hadn't been here in weeks, but the moment I turned onto the familiar winding road, everything came rushing back. The towering pines, the mountain air, the peace that had once settled over me whenever I walked through the door. But today, that peace felt like a distant memory. Today, it felt like a battleground. I parked in front of the cabin, the house looming in front of me like a stranger. There was nothing left of the sanctuary I had once known. The door stood ajar, the curtains drawn, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stepped forward, the weight of the moment settling heavily on my chest. Inside, Derek was lounging on the couch, a smug grin plastered on his face. He hadn't even heard me come in. The sight of him, so relaxed, so self-assured, made my blood boil. "So, you're back, huh?" Derek said without looking up, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I was wondering how long it would take for you to show up and make a fuss." I took a deep breath, stepping fully into the room. "It's over, Derek," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension in the air. "You sold the cabin. And it was illegal." His eyes flickered with a momentary flash of annoyance, but he quickly masked it with his usual swagger. "You're overreacting. I had to do what I had to do. You were never around anyway. What's the big deal? The money's already in the bank, and it's done. You can't change it." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to yell, to lose control. "It's not done. You didn't have the right to sell it. You knew you couldn't sell without Mary's consent. You knew that. And now you've crossed a line. I'm not letting this go." Derek's smile faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly, leaning back into the couch as though he had all the time in the world. "You're making a scene over nothing. There's nothing you can do. The sale's gone through. It's just a house, Jamie. A stupid house. You act like it's the only thing in the world that matters." I could feel the anger bubbling up again, but I kept it under control. This wasn't about a house. This was about standing up for myself, for everything I'd let him take from me for far too long. I reached into my bag and pulled out the co-ownership agreement, slapping it down onto the coffee table in front of him. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, my voice cold. "This is the proof that the sale was illegal. Without Mary's signature, it's invalid. And that means everything you've done is a lie. You're not getting away with it." For a moment, Derek didn't speak. He just stared at the document in front of him, his face draining of color as the reality of the situation began to sink in. But then, he recovered, his usual bravado returning with a snap. "That's ridiculous," he sneered. "That paper doesn't mean anything. The buyer paid in full. And I've already moved on. You think you can just undo all of that with a piece of paper?" You don't know how much I've had to sacrifice. I had no choice. You had a choice, I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. You always have a choice. But you don't care about anyone but yourself. You never have. This isn't about debts or sacrifices. This is about you taking something that wasn't yours to take. And now, you'll have to answer for it. Derek stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. You really think you can take me down, don't you? He spat, his voice thick with frustration. You think you're so much better than me? You're just a little girl playing pretend in a grown man's world. You'll never win, Jamie. I stood my ground, refusing to back down. You're wrong, Derek, I said, my voice firm, resolute. This time, I'm not the scared little girl I used to be. You may have controlled me for years, but not anymore. You've made your choices. And now, I'm making mine. Derek took a step toward me, his expression twisted with rage. You think you can just get away with this? He growled, his tone low and dangerous. I already have, I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. The sale is void. I'm going to the authorities, and I'll make sure you pay for what you've done. For a split second, I saw something flicker in his eyes, fear, maybe, or realization that his grip on everything was slipping. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He turned away, muttering under his breath as he walked toward the door. You're not going to win this, he said over his shoulder, his voice barely audible. You can't. You're nothing. But I wasn't listening anymore. As I watched him leave, I felt something inside me shift. For the first time in years, I was free. Free from his control. Free from his lies. And the cabin? It was mine. Not just the property, but everything it represented. My strength. My independence. And the start of a new chapter. As Derek slammed the door behind him, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I had one. And I was done letting him dictate my life. The door slammed shut behind Derek, but the tension didn't leave the room. I stood there, still holding the co-ownership agreement in my hands, feeling the weight of it like a promise. I had told Derek I would take him down, and now the real work was about to begin. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something powerful inside me, a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands shaking slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was the rush of finally standing up for myself, of realizing I wasn't the same person I used to be. Derek had no idea what he'd just set in motion. The phone buzzed. Mary. I answered immediately, my voice steady, despite the chaos swirling around me. It's done. He's gone. And he knows I'm not backing down. Good, she said, her voice calm, but sharp. What's next? You've got the proof, but we need to make sure we're prepared for everything. You're going to need a lawyer who can handle this. I'm already ahead of you, I replied, flipping through the pile of documents in front of me. I've contacted a firm. They're going to help us file everything we need to get this to court. I'm not letting this slide. There was a pause on the other end, and then Mary spoke again, her voice filled with conviction. You know this is just the beginning, right? Derek's not going to back down easily. He'll find a way to retaliate. I'm ready for it, I said, my words firm. He doesn't scare me anymore. And when we're done, he'll realize that he messed with the wrong person. That night, after hanging up with Mary, I couldn't sleep. The weight of everything was settling in, but it wasn't just the legal battle that had me restless. It was the realization that, for years, I had let Derek take control of my life in ways I hadn't even fully understood. He'd wormed his way into every corner of our lives, manipulating situations, using guilt, and playing on my patience. But now, I was done. The next day, I met with the lawyer. We went over every piece of evidence I had collected, every text message, every email, every legal document. It was like piecing together a puzzle, and with each new piece, the picture became clearer. Derek didn't stand a chance. The sale of the cabin wasn't just illegal, it was an outright fraud. "We'll file for an injunction immediately," the lawyer said, flipping through the documents. "We can also press charges for fraud. But you need to be prepared. This will take time and Derek will fight back. He won't let this go without making it ugly." "I'm not worried," I replied, a confidence I hadn't known I had rising in my chest. "I've spent too long letting him get away with things. This is my fight now." As the days passed, the case began to take shape. The legal team sent out cease and desist letters, and I made arrangements to meet with the real estate agent who had been involved in the sale. The agent was surprisingly cooperative, confirming everything I needed to know. Derek had forged the paperwork, pretending he had the authority to sell the cabin without Mary's consent. The buyer, who was unaware of the legal issues, had paid in full, but they hadn't received the final title transfer because the deal was never properly executed. I could feel the walls closing in on Derek. He thought he could play me, but I had a plan now. I wasn't just fighting for the cabin anymore, I was fighting for my own freedom. I received a call from the lawyer late one afternoon. "Jamie, we've got a break. The buyer is backing out. They're withdrawing from the contract, and they're willing to cooperate with our investigation. This is the leverage we need." I felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Derek wouldn't give up without a fight. I knew he would come at me with everything he had. I could practically feel his anger brewing, and I had no doubt that he would try to intimidate me or use his charm to worm his way out of this. But this time I wasn't afraid. The next confrontation came sooner than I expected. Derek showed up at the cabin unannounced, his usual arrogant grin plastered on his face. I'd been expecting him, but that didn't make my pulse slow any. He stood at the door, looking me up and down like I was an inconvenience he had to deal with. "Jamie," he said, his voice dripping with that fake sweetness. "What's all this nonsense about a lawsuit? You're going to ruin everything, you know. You'll never win. This is all just a misunderstanding." I crossed my arms, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It's not a misunderstanding, Derek. You sold something that wasn't yours to sell. You didn't have the legal right to do that. And now, we're taking it to court." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the room like a storm. "You think you can destroy me with a few papers? You don't know who you're dealing with. I've survived worse than this." I could see the desperation in his eyes, the thin veneer of confidence cracking. "You can't talk your way out of this," I said, my voice cold and final. "It's over." For a moment, Derek said nothing. The silence between us was thick with tension. Then, he let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you're going to get everything back. But I've been living this game my whole life, Jamie. You don't stand a chance." I held his gaze, unshaken. "I've been living my life, Derek. And you've been living a lie. You'll pay for it." He sneered at me one last time, then turned and left without another word. I stood there, watching him go, feeling the weight of his words hanging in the air. But as soon as the door closed behind him, I knew it was true. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. This was about taking back control of my life, about standing up to the man who had tried to ruin me for so long. The next day, the cease and desist letter went out, and the legal wheels began to turn. I could feel the momentum shifting, everything falling into place. Derek was out of options. And when the investigation into his fraudulent actions was complete, he would face the consequences. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally winning. The days dragged on with an unbearable intensity. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me, the looming court date, the endless phone calls, the paperwork that piled up on my desk like a mountain I had to climb. But with every step, I felt stronger, more in control. Derek had no idea what was coming for him, and neither did the world. The calm I felt was one I hadn't experienced in years, as if I had finally stepped out from under the shadow of someone else's life and into my own. The morning of the court hearing, I woke up with a sense of clarity. I dressed in the dark, not wanting to waste a single moment. As I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my blazer and pulling my hair into a tight ponytail, I realized just how much had changed in me. The woman staring back at me wasn't the girl who had once let Derek's words pierce through her. No. This woman was someone who had fought for her life, who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. And today, I was going to finish what I had started. The courtroom was everything I had imagined it to be, sterile, cold, and filled with the buzz of anticipation. But as I walked through the doors, there was a strange sense of calm that settled over me. I wasn't here to be intimidated. I wasn't here to apologize. I was here to claim what was rightfully mine. Derek was already sitting at one of the tables, his usual smirk plastered on his face. But today, there was a different look in his eyes, a flicker of fear, just for a moment, before he masked it with arrogance. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted me. But what he didn't know was that I had already won the moment I decided to stop letting him control me. I took my seat at the table with my lawyer, Mary by my side, and watched Derek's face darken as the proceedings began. The evidence we had gathered was irrefutable. Derek had forged signatures, manipulated documents, and lied through his teeth. There was no escaping this time. His actions, which had once seemed so confident and calculated, were now crumbling under the weight of the truth. The judge listened intently as our lawyer laid out the case. Every document we presented, every text message, every phone call Derek had made, was methodically placed in front of the court. There was no defense. No way to deny the facts. When it was Derek's turn to speak, he tried to put on his usual show, spinning his lies with the same charm he'd used to manipulate everyone around him for years. He tried to play the victim, claiming that his actions were out of desperation, that he had been struggling with debts and had no other choice. But there was no sympathy left for him. Not from me. Not from the judge. Not from anyone who had seen the evidence. I felt a sense of justice beginning to settle over me. It wasn't about the cabin anymore. It wasn't about the property or the money. It was about making sure that Derek finally understood that he couldn't control me, that he couldn't steal from me without consequences. The cabin was just the beginning. This was about reclaiming my life. The judge asked Derek to explain the sale, and he fumbled, tripping over his own lies. He couldn't keep it together, couldn't maintain the facade any longer. It was over. And when the judge made the ruling, I didn't have to hear the final words to know what was coming. Derek had lost. Everything he had worked so hard to take from me was slipping through his fingers. As the judge spoke, I felt my heart beat faster. Derek was going to be held accountable for everything he had done. Not just for selling the cabin without permission, but for the countless other ways he had manipulated and hurt the people around him. And as I sat there, listening to the gavel come down, I realized something. This victory wasn't just about the cabin. It was about me. It was about standing up for myself, finally, after years of feeling like I didn't have a voice. When the proceedings ended, I stood up and turned to Mary, who was smiling at me with a look of pride. We had done it. Together, we had taken down the man who had tried to ruin my life. And for the first time in so long, I felt a sense of peace settle in my chest. The cabin was officially mine again. But more importantly, I was mine. As I walked out of the courtroom, the weight I had been carrying for so long felt lighter. The world felt different. Brighter. And as I made my way back to the cabin, the place that had once been tainted by Derek's presence, I couldn't help but smile. I was going to rebuild it, not just the house, but my life. The cabin stood before me like a symbol of everything I had fought for. It wasn't just a building made of wood and stone. It was a reflection of my resilience, my strength, my ability to overcome the obstacles that had once felt insurmountable. As I walked through the front door, I felt something shift within me. The cabin wasn't just my refuge anymore. It was my fortress. And as the sun set over the mountains, casting a warm golden glow across the landscape, I knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. I had taken back what was mine, and no one, not Derek, not anyone, could ever take that away from me again.